Okay, folks, we are going to get started. We are still taking questions. There's a couple people holding cards here. If you, again, you have that burning question you want to ask the candidates tonight, please take a card and put it in the box on the table back there.
That's for sure. Is that there? Yeah.
So if you can take your seats, we want to try to stay on time tonight. I am Yvette Robinson. I am the chair of the Franklin County Democrats, and I want to welcome you all here tonight. I'd like to start off thanking a lot of people. I'd like to thank our candidates for driving all the way out here tonight. I'd like to thank our moderator, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming out. We have, all walks of life here. We have young voters and we have older voters, and we have people from the bigger towns, and we have people from the smaller towns all over Franklin County. We even have visitors from outside of Franklin County here tonight, and I just want everyone to feel welcome and thank you for coming out. So it has been a goal of the Franklin County Democrats to provide as many opportunities as we can for voters to meet the candidates, to learn about the candidates before they go to the polls, and to learn about important issues today. And we sincerely hope that you enjoy your evening and that you walk away feeling like you learned something. But we also have a very sincere desire for this event to be civil. We hope that each of you is respectful of everyone else in this audience, including you guys. And that you show that with your actions and your words. And so at this point, I'm going to introduce the president of the UMF Democrats, who we worked very closely with to help make this happen, Jeffrey Wiley.
Thank you, everyone, for showing up tonight. It is my honor today to introduce your moderator and our moderator, Dr. James Melcher. He is a professor of political science here at the University of Maine at Farmington, who obtained his bachelor's degree in political science in 1985 and continued his studies to earn his doctoral degree in 1985, writing a dissertation on state... 1995? Is that not what I said?
Yeah, kind of hard to do.
On state political parties, apologies. It is not? There we go. Dr. Melcher is one of the most frequently quoted political science experts here in the state of Maine, having been teaching politics here at the university since 1999. His areas of expertise include, but are certainly not limited to, the American presidency, constitutional law, elections, political parties, and state politics. As a student of Dr. Melcher, who has taken numerous classes with the professor, I can earnestly say that he is one of the most cherished, interesting professors the campus has to offer. Lectures and discussions with Dr. Melcher are insightful and incredibly interesting, and can turn the most apolitical student into an active and engaged member in our political system. In fact, there are instances in which Dr. Melcher students have gone on to win political elections, which is incredibly interesting. And his reputation with the student body is exceptional, for he is a vital and appreciated part of this campus. There is nobody more qualified to moderate this event than the professor. Without further ado, allow me to introduce Dr. James Melcher.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Well, I got to settle in here and get comfortable. I probably don't need a microphone. My voice tends to be audible in outer parts of New Sharon at this point of the evening, I am sure. When I was in graduate school, one of my friends said, when you listen really closely, you can hear Jim 300 miles away laughing if the wind is right. But I'll try and use the microphone, and please do signal if I have this off. I'd like to first off explain our format this evening. We're going to begin with several sets of questions on different topics. We're going to be starting out with questions about firearms and gun control. We'll move from there to health care, and to there from immigration, and then possibly some short questions before we then turn things over to you in the audience. Each of the candidates will have 2 minutes to answer the question, which will be challenging because the questions I've gotten are pretty lengthy. Who's our crew here to show the time, to let them, there they are. Those are not people to be trifled with. So when they say it's time, it's time. I forgot to bring my gavel down, but I can use my Capitol mug. from which we drew the beginning order. And we will cycle the order throughout. So nobody's first all the time, nobody's last all the time. We will begin with Jared Golden speaking first, then Craig Olson, then Jonathan Fulford, and then Lucas St. Clair. And then after your questions, we'll have one final question for each of the candidates to answer in 2 minutes. Why are you the candidate voters should support to replace Congressman Poliquin? All right, so without further ado, I think I would like to dive into our questions. And the first set of questions I've been asked to discuss are about firearms and firearms safety. Here in the 2nd District, many people are law-abiding firearms owners and hunters. At the same time, in the wake of the Parkland, Florida high school and Las Vegas concert massacres, and perhaps especially today, on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a date that should give us pause to ask how far we've come and how far we yet have to go. There has been an outcry across the nation for new steps to fend off gun violence, both in schools and elsewhere. The question is, as a congressman from the 2nd District, what action by the national government to deal with gun violence would you support? Some possibilities would include renewal of the so-called assault weapons ban from 1994, ban on sales of bump stocks or high-capacity magazines, repeal of the Dickey Amendment that has curbed research by the CDC, a national age of 21 to buy firearms, more spending on school security, and many others. And the other question I have been asked to ask is, would you accept campaign contributions from the National Rifle Association? We will begin with Mr. Golden.
Okay, I'll try and
And
cover.
incidentally, the mics are live all the time. So don't say anything bad about anybody's mother. Mr. Golden.
Thanks for that heads up. I'll try and cover as much as I can in 2 minutes. I think the first thing I'll say is the last. No, I'm not going to take money from the NRA. I don't. Thank you. I don't expect them to offer it to me. I have a D rating with the NRA in my 4 years in the Maine State Legislature. So since the Parkland shooting, as a Democratic leader, I have voted to move debate on banning high-capacity magazines. That would have been on rounds in excess of 10, and on banning bump stocks. That requires a bipartisan vote. In order to move that debate forward, you need at least one Republican to join us in the effort to say, yes, let's debate this issue. We did not get that. So unfortunately, both those measures died on party lines. And what we did manage to get through was a provision that the Florida legislature recently passed, which was to establish a provision in law called a red flag provision, where if someone is identified as at risk to themselves or others for any number of reasons, then authorities, particularly court authorities, would have the ability to take someone's weapons away from them for up to 180 days and possibly even renew that. So those are the things that I have supported most recently. In the past, I can also tell you I've supported similar legislation to allow possession of someone's weapons who is at risk or has committed domestic violence. That was easy for me to support because that's the #1 cause of homicide in the state of Maine. And so I think we ought to be very tough on domestic violence in this state so we can prevent those homicides from taking place in the first, from happening in the first place. Also have been a part of a very tough debate on concealed carry in this state. Senator Eric Brakey brought that bill forward. Well, I've only got 10 seconds, but I'll tell you, I led the debate and pushed to try and make a bad bill a better bill. Unfortunately, unable to, voted against the bill. So hence the D rating with the NRA. Very proud and confident and willing to do the right thing when it comes to gun control and gun safety, but I think I've taken a common sense approach as well.
Yes, Mr. Olson, you are next.
Thank you. I'll take the easy one first. No, I would not take money from the NRA, and they're not going to be offering it to me either. I grew up in a hunting culture. I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, and the interesting thing that I find as I travel around this district is that the 2nd District is really about common sense gun control. People I talk to say that there's no reason for assault-style weapons or weapons that can be made assault weapons with bump stocks. I mean, it's incredible. It's insane that we're allowing these things. So that's something that I really feel that the ban on assault weapons that was lifted, I believe if the last statistic I saw said we had reduced gun deaths by 37%. When it was in effect, and that's hard data, and that makes absolute sense. Assault weapons are not sporting weapons, so I really would like to see an appeal of that, a ban of bump stocks, banning of the high-capacity magazines, common sense to address guns in a common sense fashion, as people do in the state, as I talk to people around there, and understanding that it's not. What I see when I'm out in the district, it's not a personal protection mentality, it's a hunting mentality. It's a very different thing, and all parts of the nation are different in that respect. So I think by just painting anybody who's a gun owner or anybody who is a hunter as being, kind of crazy and ready to march behind Wayne LaPierre down the middle of the street is not something that we can do in the 2nd District. And I also think it's important that we have a universal background check system that is enforced and that people don't fall through those cracks, as we had happen with the person in Texas who had fallen through the cracks through the Navy. So it's a lot of common sense things that can be done, I think, and that don't require millions and millions and millions of dollars, but do require people to be cognizant of what it is like to own and use a gun in the state of Maine. Thank you.
Mr. Fulford, you have 2 minutes.
Okay. I'll follow that order as no, I will never take any NRA campaign funds. I will not take any corporate PAC money. I will not take any corporate lobbyist money. I will not take any dark money for any purposes. So, and I believe that a universal background check nationally is essential on all gun sales. That I think will also help address the gun violence of domestic abuse, abusers getting a hold of guns, which is the largest cause of homicides in the state. I also think that the banning of bump stocks and the other mechanical aid to turn a semi-automatic weapon into essentially a fully automatic weapon should be, that should be banned. We should not loosen any restrictions on silencers. These are and we should also have a ban on high-capacity magazines. These are the primary mechanisms in which a weapon can be turned into something that can cause mass casualty. So I'm in support of all that. I think that also the Dickey Amendment needs to be overturned so we can actually have good, hard data about actually what the effects of gun violence are in this country, so we can have a more accurate discussion in our society about the risks that are posed. When you don't have data, then you don't have a fully informed conversation. I would also say that the concealed weapon, loosening concealed weapon ban so it can go across state lines is also a mistake. So it should not be that because one state has extremely loose, lax laws that every state has to allow that. So, yeah. And I think that does it for me right there. So.
Mr. St. Clair, you have 2 minutes.
So thank you very much for being here, and it's great to see so many engaged voters. I grew up in northern Maine. I was a hunter. I am a hunter. I own guns, and I hunt on a regular basis. When I sit in a duck blind with a shotgun, I am by law required to not have any more than 3 shells in my shotgun at any given time. That is a law that all of us that hunt have accepted. It essentially tells me that we are valuing the lives of ducks more than we're valuing the lives of children in our country, and it's a disgrace to see that. When it comes to large capacity magazines, when it comes to silencers, when it comes to muzzle speed and the size of bullets, semi-automatic and automatic weapons, all of those things together define assault rifles for me, and they should be limited. They should be allowed on the battlefield and not in the schools, not in vehicles, and not in movie theaters, churches, and various other places. We should absolutely repeal the Dickey Amendment. The CDC has done a great job evaluating the safety of vehicles and cigarette smoking and alcohol consumption. and various other things that have been causing harm to Americans. And after the evaluation of that harm, we've been able to curb the use and make people's lives safer. We should absolutely allow that to happen with gun safety. We should allow for the red flag law if someone is a safety to themselves or others and they are in the possession of weapons. We should be able to remove those weapons for a period of time until their safety and the safety of people around them are able to be analyzed. And I think that most importantly, we should be able to have an honest conversation with each other about this. This is not something to put on a political spectrum, to retreat to our corners and throw bombs. This is about coming together and having honest kinds of conversations about our children and our children's safety and our own personal safety.
Thank you all. You will each now have, if you wish to use it, 1 minute for response or rebuttal in the same order. So we'll begin with Mr. Golden.
Thank you. I think in large part we all agreed on a lot of things here, so not a
I
whole
said
lot
1
to
minute if
rebut.
you need it.
I do want to talk a little bit about what I meant by taking a common sense approach, though. I do think we all have to acknowledge the fact that in Maine CD2 gun ownership is an important thing to many people. Question 3, to expand to universal background checks, failed in every single county in this district. I think it passed in like 22 municipalities out of about 350. So we got a lot of work to do talking to our neighbors before I think we have broad consensus on many of these issues. I support universal background checks. Something that I've heard set up here talking about silencers. I've actually voted to allow hunters to use silencers. Many landowners want a less intrusive, I think, loud weapon being used in order to allow hunters to have access on their land. And I believe that that was a measure that passed what we call under the hammer in the Maine state legislature, which means 151 members of the Maine House of Representatives agreed that that was perfectly common sense, safe, and not harmful.
Next, Mr. Olson, you have 1 minute.
The only thing I would add is I do really think that we need to see the research on gun violence, and that needs to be done through the CDC. You know, we have to have this data. We have to be able to have a valid data to base our arguments on and to move this thing forward. What I find simply incredible is that, I don't know how many of you remember, maybe some of you are too young, but the game of lawn darts. We had lawn darts when I was a kid, and they were banned because somebody was killed with a lawn dart. So the fact that we are not doing that with assault rifles and with bump stocks and high-capacity magazines, I find is just, it's unconscionable, and we need to have more data.
Mr. Fulford, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, I'll roll on. This is, I agree with that. I think there's pretty much agreement on what measures are necessary, and that the importance of this issue in CD2, I think, is this: in order to have any Democratic candidate win in this district, we're going to have to all take responsibility of having these conversations with our neighbors in order to make sure that this issue moves forward and is not what actually eliminates any Democrat from being able to succeed in this race. So that's upon all of us. So.
Mr. St. Clair, you have 1 minute.
So I'll also add that I would not take money from the NRA, and certainly the NRA will not offer myself or anyone on this stage any money, and we can guarantee that. But I also will say that while it is an issue that is challenging, we have to lean into this. While gun safety is not a particularly threatening issue in Maine, as a representative of Maine in the United States Congress, in the United States it is an issue. 1.5 million people have died since 1970. We have to lean into this and have honest conversations about how to fix it. And so I think equivocating on our position in any way does not address the challenge that we're faced.
Very good. We're now going to move on to health care as a topic. The 2nd District includes many rural areas where hospitals such as Franklin Memorial here in Farmington face significant financial and cost containment challenges. At the same time, many Mainers still find it difficult to get medical care, including prescriptions that they need at a price that they can afford. What policies do you support in health care to help deal with these challenges, and how would you pay for them? Possibilities could include public option, single payer, expansion of the current ACA, or Republican-backed plans to offer tax credit-based approaches. And specifically, do you support the ACA's mandates for birth control coverage by employers and continued Title X federal funding of family planning? And we'll begin with Mr. Olson.
Thank you. I live in a small rural community, and we have a rural health center, and we get a very good level of care, and we're very fortunate to have it. But I do talk to people when they have issues that have to deal with cancer and going for treatment, that it's a very difficult thing to do. And what I'm finding, and one of the reasons I got in this race, is because I had dealt with skin cancer a few years ago, and that kind of got me gelled when I saw them trying to repeal the ACA. My point with healthcare is that we have to work to improve the ACA as it stands and improve it down the road, and hopefully go to a single payer source or some type of universal healthcare system that covers everybody equally. I've had that 3 a.m. waking up wondering how I'm going to pay my medical bills because I didn't have the money to cover the medical bills for surgery. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. And I think it needs to be a system that it's paid, and similar to the way we fund Medicare now. I'm not saying it should be a Medicare for all necessarily, but it needs to be a universal system, so that right now we're paying 2.95% in Medicare. You're paying out of your paycheck. You pay half, your employer pays half. What are the numbers if we raise that to 10%? 5% comes out of every working American's paycheck to go into a pool to pay for their health care. The other 5% is matched by their employer. As a small business person, being able to know that percentage, saying, well, I'm going to hire somebody for $30,000, I know that can offer them full health insurance, or they will have full health insurance, and it's going to cost me $1,500 a year. That's a budgetable expense. Now, I don't know how the numbers fall out, but 10% is an easy one to just, to do the math in your head. But I really feel that we need to have a universal system. As I talk to people throughout the district, and I'm talking to people on both sides of the aisle, 90% of them are telling me we need a universal system. There is no reason that we are not covering our neighbors and our friends and the people down the road. And as far as maintaining the ACA mandate for birth control in Title X, I do agree with that. I think it needs to be maintained.
Thank you. Mr. Fulford, you have 2 minutes.
Cool. Single-payer Medicare for all. That's where we need to move to. So. And 9% is actually the number that is what it takes. If it was funded as a payroll deduction, 9% would cover it. It's 32% less cost to us than our current medical care system. It would provide health care for every single man, woman, and child in this entire country. And with no deductibles, no premiums, no nothing. It's just like that's what it costs. If we could fund it in other mechanisms, but if you want to have the simple numbers, that's one possible way to do it. If we want to tackle the opioid addiction crisis, we have to actually have a single-payer Medicare for all system or a universal health care of some form, but I think that's the right one, as the foundation for it, because it's a medical crisis, not a criminal crisis, and we need to treat people as with the respect that they need in order to actually get the help which they're going to need to overcome that addiction. And also, if we want to have a strong rural economy, then we also have to have health care available to everybody, no matter where they live in this district. And again, having this kind of health care system in place will keep the hospitals more vibrant, the clinics more happening, more available. It doesn't matter if you have health insurance, even if you have all the money in the world, if there's no medical care within 3 hours of you. So this is, I think, fundamental. And I would also support, of course, in any, both with the Affordable Care Act, but also with any form of single-payer Medicare for all support for the Title X and making sure that birth control is and abortions are actually available and funded through this process.
Thank you. Mr. St. Clair, you have 2 minutes.
So I believe that healthcare is a human right and not a privilege. It should be affordable, it should be accessible, and it should be easy to understand. In the analysis that I've done, I feel like a single-payer Medicare expansion would be the fastest and most efficient way to get to that. I believe that women's reproductive rights and a woman's right to choose are just that, a woman's right to choose, and shouldn't be tampered with regardless of what kind of health care that is provided to them. And agree with all of the challenges that we're faced with in our country, with the cost of medication. My father has leukemia, and the medication that he takes costs $130,000 annually. If he had to pay that out of pocket, it would force bankruptcy, like it does for 52% of the personal bankruptcies that exist in our country. We cannot allow our population to go into bankruptcy to make sure that they are well. And this is a straightforward plan that is in place, that is affordable, and something that's very achievable. But a market-based healthcare system that's in place now is preventing that. And we absolutely need to change that paradigm.
Mr. Golden, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. 4 years in the legislature, 100% Planned Parenthood voting record. I think that ought to tell you where I stand in regards to the latter part of the question. I personally have been the beneficiary of a government health care system, the Department of Veterans Affairs. Some of you out in the crowd have as well, either through the VA or through Medicare, and I hear that you like it. It's a good program. So I do push back against the critics that say that our government is not capable of providing a good health care service. I don't believe it. Look at the transition to the Affordable Care Act. It certainly did bring a little bit of chaos trying to change a very big, complex healthcare system. While I support moving in the direction of universal, adamantly, I do think that it's going to take some time, particularly in a divided government. So there's a proposal out there to start marching in the right direction by lowering the age of eligibility for Medicare to 55. I think that's a good proposal and a way to slowly move in the right direction, and we'll get there someday. We've been asked a bit of a leading question in regards of how would we pay for it. I think sometimes Democrats fall into a trap about talking about taxes, which our Republican friends love. The healthcare system is very expensive. There's a lot of profit being made. We're paying a lot out of our pockets. So for starters, let's redirect some of that into paying for our government healthcare system. No one is talking about that up here for one thing. It's also about setting priorities in government. It's not always just about raising more. 17 years in Afghanistan and Iraq, how many trillions of dollars? Is that our priority, or is it giving health care to the Americans? So let's take all that into account before we start talking about how else we might find ways to pay for this. Thank you.
Our next topic is immigration. Certainly one of the leading issues of the 2016 campaign on a campus where we have many immigrant students, an issue of great concern. So a major issue of debate today, both here in Maine and nationally, is immigration policy. As a congressman, what immigration policies would you support? Specifically, do you support DACA and allowing the Dreamers to remain in the United States? And do you support Trump administration policies such as increased ICE enforcement in sanctuary cities and a wall on the Mexican border? And we will begin. We'll find what the answers out are, won't we? We will begin with Mr. Fulford.
So yeah, I very much support DACA and a path to citizenship for people who are here. I am opposed to the expansion of the ICE program. I think it was dramatically expanded actually underneath Obama. I think that was a disappointment on my part, a strong disappointment on how aggressive he was in that area, and it's continued and only worsened. And the wall is a boondoggle, the classic definition of a boondoggle. Waste of our taxpayer money for something which will do no good. So I think that recognizing that having strong immigrant communities are actually good for both Maine, but also good for the country, is I think essential. That when you look at the statistics, you know, they tend to be much more law-abiding than the average of us, and hardworking and contribute to our economy in many, many essential ways, including our healthcare system in rural areas. If you look at that. I think that another component of the, what to put here, the climate change is an issue which affects immigration. And if we actually have an attitude of hardening our borders and hardening our walls, and we model that for the world, that is only going to destabilize further our international peace. And as we actually look at the way that climate change is forcing migration through the lack of for people no longer being able to live in places they've lived for thousands of years because of drought and flooding, then we need to actually, as a part of the global, as global citizens, as a nation, we need to actually address that, and that's in putting resources into making sure that everywhere in the world remains a viable place for people to live is part of actually dealing with immigration policy. And I think that is also a way to lessen our, we can take our military budget and reduce our military budget and put it into actually making sure that everybody has a good life, and that is better for us. We'll roll from there.
Okay. I'm watching my timekeepers down there to see.
Yeah.
Next, Mr. St. Clair, you have 2 minutes.
So I also support a path to citizenship for the Dreamers and for DACA. I think that we need to recognize that the pride that we have in our country should be reflected in the fact that people are choosing to come here. That may, as a patriotic American, that gives me a lot of pride. And we need to find ways to appropriately allow people to come into our country and to find ways to integrate into the communities that they come to. My grandparents were immigrants, and I think many people here have an immigrant story in their American story. We absolutely need to consider this in a destabilized world that we're living in, especially when it comes to climate change. Jonathan is absolutely correct. The fact that Syrian refugees are traveling around the world right now is directly related to climate change and a drought in the agricultural areas of Syria, and that will continue to happen. There are 250,000 people from Puerto Rico living in Orlando right now. It'll continue to happen as we have events like happened in Houston and Miami and Atlanta and Phoenix and Tampa and Louisiana. New Orleans is going to continue to happen, and we need to find ways for people to be able to move safely around this country and around this world. And we also need to consider the fact that many people that come here are not choosing to leave their homes, just like we would not choose to leave our homes, and recognizing that there are crises that are happening around the country and around the world, and we need to be able to embrace people's hardship and find a place for them to be safe and a place for them and their families to continue their lives. So I think we need to take a hard look at immigration, do it in a responsible and a kind way.
Thank you. Mr. Golden, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. So I think it was just last week or the week before that Bruce Poliquin attacked everyone on this stage, accusing us of loving illegal immigration in sanctuary cities. Just to be clear, we do not think that illegal immigration is the best way to move forward, but we do support immigration, and we have a broken immigration system. It needs to be fixed, and Congress has failed to do so repeatedly. So big surprise that that is the pathway for some people. But I also think it's interesting to watch him talk tough on illegal immigration in a state where there's hardly any. He blurs the lines between what's legal and what's not. And by doing so, he puts my community under attack. Somali immigration to the city of Lewiston has been a good thing for my community. In the ways in which he talks about this, casting doubt on whether or not someone here seeking asylum from a war-torn country is here legally or are they illegal, I find it disgusting. It makes me angry. I have no stomach for people being picked on like that. So I am strongly in support of immigration. We need that in this state. We are losing people in population and workforce. We need more people to come call Maine home. My preference is for those that would like to come here and call Maine home permanently and work in our communities and make this a better place. In terms of DACA, yes, I would support that. Border wall, big waste of money. Sometimes when you're serving in the state legislature or in Congress, you have to make some tough decisions. And when you have to do that, I think you put the priority on humans first. So the only way I would ever support border wall money would be if it resulted in protecting those DACA people by saying, yes, in return for making sure that they're protected and able to stay here, we'll give you some of your border wall money. That would have been, I think, the right thing to do to protect those individuals, people first, sometimes before the political battles. But in general, I agree with Jonathan, it's a waste of money.
Mr. Olson, you have 2 minutes.
I certainly support DACA and a path to citizenship. And what's interesting, as Jared pointed out, is that we have a state that's aging. People are dying faster than they're being born. Population's being reduced in Maine. We need immigrants. That's what built Maine. Maine didn't just kind of spring out of nothing and all of a sudden was a success. I mean, we had immigrants coming in, immigrants who had issues and who had problems, and that's part of any community. But what's happening, it's interesting, and I've spent quite a bit of time, my wife grew up in Arizona, so I spent quite a bit of time in that border region, and her grandmother's actually from Mexico. And the interesting thing is that it's an issue at the nth degree at the national level, but when you're down there and you meet people and you talk to people, and I've seen the border wall in Nogales, and it's absolutely atrocious. It's not going to another wall is not going to keep people out. They're doing more with electronic surveillance and all of that. I mean, that's actually being effective. But what it is, and if you saw the news today, I believe that the president has signed an order. He's going to send National Guard troops to the border to protect us. And what's interesting about it is a complete shell game. What we need to be doing is getting out of places, 17 years in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We need to be reducing that funding. We need to be getting out of those places. We need to be funding things within the State Department. We need to be working on foreign aid. We need to be working on the effects of climate change and food source. That's where the funding has to be going instead of the shell game, or I was telling somebody, it's like seeing a magician, you know, don't pay any attention to this hand over here because this hand is what's actually really doing the damage. And you know, that's the issue that we've run into, and I think that we are just maligning immigrants just as a scapegoat because it's easy. And I've been down there and I've seen people who are working as day laborers in Arizona, standing outside of Lowe's looking for work, and none of them look like any of us, and they're working hard and they're making their best in the world that they've come into. So,
Thank you. Now, I realized that I forgot to allow time for a rebuttal to the last question, but there is so much agreement here, relatively speaking. It slipped my mind. So what I'm going to do next is give each of the candidates 1 minute to either offer any additional comments on health care or on immigration. And we will begin with Mr. Fulford. Anything on immigration or on health care?
Sure. I think one of the key things around healthcare is that in any reform of healthcare, we're going to have to also break up the large healthcare monopolies, which are going to make any reform difficult. So that has to be part of it, is breaking up that power. And also to remember with healthcare that a single-payer Medicare for all will make small businesses and large businesses more competitive and open up much more opportunity. As a small business owner, I could not afford healthcare until the Affordable Care Act myself, nor have my employees ever been able to. I could never provide it for them. That will make small businesses much more successful and better for all. And there's a disadvantage in our labor rates when we are going up against every other industrialized country, including Canada, when their labor they can pay less because they already have health care. So we'll straighten that out. And around immigration, I think it's really worth remembering that many people have fled here because of violence and oppression from the destabilized political systems in countries, and they need to be saluted for the hardships they've gone through and welcomed.
Thank you. Mr. St. Clair, 1 minute on potluck here, on immigration or on health care.
So one thing about immigration that has become apparent to me in this campaign is in Fort Kent and Calais and Jackman, the conversation about the Canadian border and these Maine communities that are backed up to the Canadian border that are limited in their ability to trade and work across the border. And that is a result of the TSA and the hardening of borders, and it's creating problems here with Maine towns. And we often say that we're at the end of the line. In fact, we're not. We cross the river, and all of a sudden, you're in another country. And if we are able to effectively trade and move back and forth across the Canadian border, I think it would add a lot of potential prosperity in the towns in Washington, Aroostook County specifically.
Thank you. Mr. Golden, you have 1 minute.
I think I just want to remind everyone about Bruce Poliquin's vote on health care, right? He voted to take it away from 100,000 people in this state. Let's not let him off the hook. Terrible vote. It's also the way he behaved. He didn't want to tell you how he planned to vote. After he took the vote, he didn't really want to take the time to explain to you why. He's been hiding ever since. We all know the story about him trying to run into the bathroom. You know, just several months later, in November of 2017, the same community, Maine CD2, voted to expand Medicaid to 70,000 people. Tell me that's not going in the opposite direction of their congressman. So let's hold them accountable. It was also bad for our economy. Rural Maine hospitals, our healthcare service providers are some of the biggest employers that we have in Maine CD2. So bad healthcare vote, bad economic vote. We're going to take it to them on this issue because it's vastly important to the state of Maine. I do want to talk about the issue of the Canadian border because I do think sometimes it can be abused. So we do see sometimes LLCs bringing in Canadian workers instead of using Maine loggers and abusing H-2A, H-2B, and other visa programs. So immigration good, but not when corporations abuse it.
Mr. Olson, you have 1 minute.
I wasn't going to comment, but then one thing came up. Talking about healthcare being good for business and having a universal care system, I was talking with the economic development director in Caribou, and he was talking about the major health center up there and the fact that he said when you go at shift change, you're going to see so many Canadian license plates going across the border because they hire nurses who live in Canada because they don't have to pay the health insurance costs. And that just floored me. That was not something I had really even conceived of, and I think that was really an interesting telling of what will happen when we have a universal care system where it makes sense in business. And I'm not saying that they're not good nurses and that they shouldn't have jobs, but it's just interesting that that type of a situation happens within the healthcare profession right here in Maine.
Thank you very much. We have time before we get to the audience questions for one more area, and given how many students, including my students, are here tonight, I really didn't think I could let you leave the stage without answering a question about student debt. A lot of our students who are currently here are taking on very large quantities of student debt. Many of my alumni have high student debt. There are issues this poses for people who want to buy a home, people that want to spend on a new car, spend on a variety of things, or finding it relatively difficult to do so because of the levels of student debt that they hold. So I think we have time for 1 minute and 1 minute rebuttal from each of you. What should the national government's policy be about student loans and alleviation of student debt? And we will begin with Mr. St. Clair.
Well, certainly, if we're going to student debt and the cost of education is a real challenge, and the cost of education has grown faster than inflation, and so there's an issue there. The fact that student debt stays with people and you can't get bankrupt, bankruptcy doesn't alleviate the challenge, is a huge issue. Although if you get an education, you can't foreclose on that education and get it back. So there's a challenge there. But if we are really going to value an educated group of Americans, then we need to find ways to make it affordable, to encourage people to do it. If you're graduating from college and have more debt than the average mortgage in our country, it's setting up an impossible scenario. So we absolutely need to focus on reducing the amount of debt and reducing the cost of education.
Thank you. Let's wait for the applause to die down. Mr. Golden, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. I think we have to stop treating education, higher education, like a for-profit industry. So let's put a cap on those outrageous interest rates. Interest rates that are like credit cards. It's awful. Let's hold the for-profit colleges and universities accountable for their bad practices. Excuse me. For those of you that are stuck with the debt now in the Maine State Legislature, I've been fighting for a student debt relief bond. Hopefully we will find some agreement with the governor this year and get that passed. For those of you in the future, I've got a unique opportunity and proposal for you. I served this country for 4 years in the United States Marine Corps. I fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. When I came home, the government paid for my college education. I want a universal service option program in America. If you're willing to give 2 years of your life to America, working as a teacher, working on the streets, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, or in the military, then I think the government should help pay for your college education.
Thank you. Mr. Olson, 1 minute.
Thank you. I think that, the thing that's always struck me is that the companies and people can declare bankruptcy and absolve themselves of debt, but people who have overburdened student loans don't have a clue, don't have any way, and that goes with you forever. I'm not saying you should use it lightly because it does just wreck your credit score, but it's something for some people that has to be a viable option. I think there's also needs to be increase at the federal level of the Pell Grant system. So we're actually helping students more with those daily expenses. We need to give Pell Grants in addition to the funding that they're getting just to offset tuition, but also like with the Maine Community College system where if you go full-time, it's about $3,600, I think, for a tuition. If you qualify for a Pell Grant, you get $5,600. You get $2,000 for getting to and from school, for food and other things like that, because there's a large percentage of food insecurity within the community college system in Maine. So I think we need to be looking at all those options, and again, I do think too that these loan companies, it's predatory lending. I mean, it's right up there for me like payday loans, the way they're taking advantage of people who are vulnerable. I mean, you want to get an education, you want to improve yourself, and you want every opportunity out there, and they see that.
Thank you. Mr. Fulford, you have 1 minute.
So I support with existing student loans to have the interest rates go down to the lowest commercial rate available for commercial banks. So this cut it right down. And I think we also need to have free higher public education. You know, that doesn't help who already have debts, but I think it would, moving forward, it would make it so that you're not coming out of debt. Your private education, that's a different issue, but you'll have a lower interest rate on your bills if you do that. I think that as we need to tool up for addressing the challenges of having our workforce make the economy that we need to in order to address climate change, having people have these educations available to them, including in the trades, is going to be essential. And we just have to make that not bankrupt people, you know, destroy them. And most of my children's friends have left the state because they had to either when they went to college or afterwards in order to get a job that paid well enough in order to service their student debt. And that's devastating to our rural communities.
Thank you very much. Now, if any of you has anything to add, we'll give you each 1 minute more for rebuttal. We'll begin with Mr. St. Clair. Not that there was a lot to rebut in the remarks.
I think I agree with everything that has been said, and there's some interesting solutions and certainly a way to make sure that we prioritize higher education. And regardless, even still the amount it costs, it's still a better investment than not doing it. So we have to recognize that and then find ways to make it more affordable.
Thank you. Mr. Golden.
Thank you. I'm going to take just a little bit of leeway, but we're all talking about student debt these days, and I know that it's very important. I think we all have also come to realize that it's not always necessary to get a college education to be successful in life. There are other great opportunities out there for people, and we got to keep that in mind. I think people in the state believe that. But something that I want to talk about is a proposal that I'm putting the priority on, one of my top 3, which is universal pre-K Head Start, public education in this country. Absolutely necessary to get our youth an early start so that they're ready to go to college when they're 18, 19, or 20 years old. Also, just it's an economic driver. It helps get people out of poverty. It helps young families that can't afford childcare send their kid to public education at the earliest age so that they can focus on getting out there and getting back to work as well.
Thank you. Mr. Olson, you have 1 minute.
I'm going to pass.
Very good. More time for questions from the audience. What a crowd pleaser he is. Mr. Fulford. Gauntlets to you now.
Yeah, no, I think that I do agree also that was good with the universal pre-K as an additional part. Also, I'd have to say, one of the things around education that needs to be addressed, this is another divergence from this, but right now, Social Security, if you're a public school, if you're a teacher or a public employee, you cannot, you are docked on your Social Security, and that impacts people's lives and it impacts the numbers of teachers which get in later in life who bring their life experiences into it. That is something that needs to be corrected on a federal level. I think if we had a caucus, including, because California is one of the 14 states that did this, we actually had an aggressive challenge where we just said as a caucus we're going to stand up against this and force it as part of the reform of Social Security. I think it would be helping the teacher profession, which would help our educational systems. So.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move to the audience question portion of the debate on cards that have been turned into us. And because a lot of these questions are complicated, I think I'll change the format slightly. 2 minutes for each person to respond without a rebuttal. It seems that would give people a little more detail. And the first question I from the audience is, what kinds of changes do you propose to combat or adapt to global climate change? And we begin with Mr. Golden.
Thank you. For starters, let's trust the scientists and put our faith in them. They are the professionals. I have watched here in Maine the Department of Environmental Protection be gutted, underfunded, and torn apart by this governor's administration in many ways. I fear that that is what might happen at the national level. So I think a top priority for me is making sure that the EPA has the funding, the resources, the staff, the experts that they need to do their job. Very important. Get back into the Paris Accords. Let's be a global leader on a global problem. It's unacceptable that we're not leading from the front on that issue, and I think it's critical that Congress push this administration to do that. Clearly, we got to get off fossil fuels, so we got to make every investment we can in renewable energy, in cleaner, better, fuel-efficient vehicles, in different kinds of technologies that also rely on fossil fuels right now as well. So, a complex issue, complex solution.
Thank you. Mr. Olson, you have 2 minutes.
It's a great question, and we have to get back, of course, in the Paris Accords. We have to have a seat at the table. I mean, we have to be seen as a world leader, as a world power in energy, and Maine is just uniquely seated for that. We're sitting right in the middle of it. I mean, we've got the tides, we've got the wind, we've got the wood stock in the North Woods. I mean, it's amazing what we have out there that we're just kind of dabbling in. And for me, we've got to have a push. We've got to push into these alternative sources of energy. That's going to help with climate change. We have to do more with efficiency of our cars and of our homes and weatherization and all of those issues that bring that whole carbon footprint down. And looking at ways to be more efficient. We have a program that we've had in our community. It's called Window Dressers, and it's a group in Rockland, Maine that's gotten together, and they've actually create interior storms for your windows at a very low cost, and they increase your R value by an exponential amount by putting that interior storm in your window. And they've done something, and they just, I got a mailer from them the other day, and they've reduced the use of about, I think they said 24 million gallons of fuel oil with this program that they've been doing over the last 5 or 6 years. So there are all these opportunities out there, and I think Maine is poised to get into that, and I think we just have to, go to Washington. We have to, put the EPA back together, and get out there and be a leader like we should be and like we've been in many other instances.
Thank you. Mr. Fulford, you have 2 minutes.
Climate change is why I decided to get involved in politics and run for office, instead of just being a political activist from the outside trying to force change on a system which was resistant to actually responding to the voices of the people. I have 5 grandchildren, and their future is which reminds me of my investment in making change. In order to make the changes necessary for to address climate change successfully, it'll be the largest jobs creator we've seen in this country since World War II. There'll be jobs in every single town in this entire district, as well as across the entire country. As a builder who's specialized in energy efficiency, I know the amount of work it takes to make our housing stock meet the climate change goals, the climate greenhouse gas goals we need to reach. And that is a lot of good work for electricians, plumbers, insulation, every last trade there is. And we can do it now with no different technology than we have. Same with installing of renewable energy with rooftop solar and commercial scale solar. It's also as far as driving the economy around agriculture as we respond to the demands of Maine stepping up to become the breadbasket of New England again as climate change affects our food production globally and nationally. We have put the incentives in actually capturing carbon in the soils. It's the best solution we have to actually not just reduce our carbon footprint, but actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. We could take 10 billion tons a year, potentially, out of, if we did this on a global scale. Right now, there's about 200 billion tons of too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is actually a path to successfully, within 20 years, bring us back down to the levels we need to. It's actually a hopeful message. If we put the economic incentives to make that happen with our forestry practices and our agricultural practices, it'll be an enormous economic boon for Maine and for the entire country. This is what we need to do. This is where the economy needs to go. It'll keep us out of resource wars globally. This is good for everyone. So.
Thank you. Mr. St. Clair, you have 2 minutes.
So I've been working professionally over the last almost decade on climate change issues. I've been endorsed by the League of Conservation Voters, and I chaired the board of the Maine Conservation Voters before I got into this race. I have 2 young children, 4 and 7, and they make me think about this more and more every day. I think the 2 main focuses is mitigation and adaptation. When we think about mitigation, we have to address the things that have been brought up already. Our use of energy, our transportation systems, our agricultural systems, our food distribution systems all need to be addressed that will mitigate the amount of carbon dioxide that's being released into the atmosphere. We can do that in a sound and financially, fiscally responsible way that can benefit the economy. From an adaptation standpoint, we need to focus, I think, on the advice that E.O. Wilson has shared in his recent Pulitzer Prize-winning book called Half Earth. And we need to conserve our land and our water to make sure that it can adequately support life on this planet. And if we are not focusing directly on conservation, we will not be able to adapt to a warming and a changing climate.
Thank you. Our next question is, given Trump administration moves to privatize the Veterans Administration, how do you feel about privatizing the VA? We'll start with Mr. St. Clair.
I'm absolutely opposed to it. Again, somewhat of a leading question, but and I think, but if anything, we need to make sure that the VA is fully funded and is providing the services that veterans need. And so we've seen the privatization of medicine in this country has led to these impossibly expensive medical situations and the bankruptcies that we're experiencing now. It's clear that that is not the way to go.
Mr. Olson, 2 minutes.
We can't, I completely agree. You hate to say that about somebody you're running against.
It's okay.
But that's okay. But I agree. I mean, you cannot privatize the Veterans Administration. I mean, we owe the folks that they serve an incredible debt, both, the physical and mental damage that's happened in the last, not only the last 17 years, but for all living veterans. It's incredible that we would privatize something like that and let it become a nickel and dime type of situation. We can't do that. My grandfather got all of his care from the VA. He was a World War II vet who was wounded in France. All of his care, right down to his open heart surgery, was all VA based, and it was a great place for him, and it served him well. We cannot privatize it because, as Lucas said, we've seen what has happened within the medical system with privatization of a lot of healthcare, and it's just a spiral down.
Mr. Fulford, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, that is really a dumb idea. I mean, take a medical delivery system, which is actually one of the best we have in this country, and ruin it, for increasing the profits of a few. That is just ridiculous and I think cruel. So yeah, I'm opposed to that one, I would say. And the direction we have to go with healthcare obviously is the exact opposite. And I think as it was said, the VA is a great model of what actually a single payer system works, how it works. And as the overhead there is, I believe, around 2%. And it's just this is the model of what we need to go forward with. That and Medicare. These are success stories. Don't ruin them.
Mr. Golden, you have 2 minutes.
Well, as a combat veteran of Afghanistan and Iraq, I think you know what I'm going to say. So, no, 100% not on board with any form of privatization of the Department of Veterans Affairs. We cannot risk turning, that healthcare system into one that is focused on profit more than it is care for all of our veterans. Let's acknowledge that the VA system isn't perfect, though. Ask my generation, ask Vietnam veteran generation. It has room for improvement. It needs to be properly funded, resourced. We have to help them change with changing times, changing wars, changing wounds. Invest in research and development. and in rural areas, make sure that we are doing everything we can to increase access to the VA healthcare system. I see Congress constantly blaming the VA bureaucracy. I see the VA constantly blaming Congress and saying we don't have the resources. They're serving a population of people that were taught that the buck stops here, that you don't blame other people for failures, you take responsibility for them. So that's what they need to do, and then they need to work together to reform a system that is good, that's taking care of our veterans, but could certainly be better.
Our next question, what is your policy concerning cannabis and the federal government and marijuana? I think I lost track of the order I was going in, so I'm just going to go down the aisle. We'll start with Mr. Fulford.
I think that cannabis needs to be legalized on a federal level. I think that if we have, in order to have an effective drug treatment program or dealing with addictions and overdoses, we actually need to model our system on Portugal. It's the most successful one in the world. Portugal has a program where the use of drugs is legal, not always selling of drugs, because there's drugs which are really dangerous to have in society, but if you're a user, you are not stigmatized because of that addiction, and instead you are given treatment. And they have, right now, if you remember, in Maine, we had about 416 deaths last year from opioid addiction out of 1.3 million people. In Portugal, they have 3 deaths per million. They went from the highest drug death rate and abuse rate in all of Europe to the lowest. They are 5 times lower than even any other European country. If you actually care about treating addiction problems, look at what has been successful and model it on that instead of sticking to an ideological belief system of punishment which has failed completely.
Mr. Golden.
Well, Maine just voted to legalize marijuana in this state, and unfortunately we have a governor who is vetoing every effort in the legislature to put in place regulations and rules so that we can move forward with what the people voted on. Maine has had medical marijuana since the 1990s. It's been there for a lot of people that needed that as an alternative form of care to treat symptoms that it was appropriate for. I think that the federal government should not step upon the decisions that this state has made in any way. I also have concerns about marijuana use, just like I do about alcohol use or alcohol abuse. We know that it is something that can be helpful to people. We know it is something that can be harmful to people. We should treat it that way. I don't think there's strong common agreement about the issue. In fact, this failed in Lewiston by referendum at the municipal level in 2014. It passed at the state level in 2016. So absolutely supportive of our medical marijuana program, supportive of the reality that prohibition is a dismal failure and it has punished people, put people into jail unnecessarily. The war on drugs doesn't work. We need treatment, education, and other healthy ways of addressing this problem. I think that marijuana has its uses and also its dangers.
Thank you. Mr. Olson, you have 2 minutes.
So 3 things. At the federal level, legalize it, tax it, and do the research. We need to know what the effects of marijuana are, but we also just heard a report was just published recently saying that there's been one experiment that's been done, research paper that's been done on shifting people from opioid use to medical marijuana use, and they've had very good reaction and a very good recovery and help in managing pain and all that. And marijuana will not kill you. Opioids do, and we see that in this state. So we need to do that. We have to be smart about it, and we also have to have a federal banking system that allows people who are in that industry to actually be able to buy and sell and put money in the bank and take checks and credit cards and all of that and not deal on a cash basis. Because that's going to create even greater creates even greater problems. So I think it's a fascinating area that's pushing forward. Maine's on the forefront, and I hope that at the federal level we can move it as well.
Mr. St. Clair.
The sweet smell of spring just wafted through this room. It was coincided with this question really nicely. I support the legalization of recreational marijuana and medical marijuana. I do agree with my colleagues on the stage that it needs to be, the effects need to be studied. We need to make sure that its medical uses are allowed to get to the people that need them, whether it's in hospice care or whether it's for everyday aches and pains. We need to adjust the way we think about the criminalization and the war on drugs and mandatory minimums. You know, we have a fifth of the world's population and 25% of the world's incarcerated. It is completely backwards that we're doing that, you know, spending $80 billion annually on locking people up, and oftentimes it's for marijuana offenses. I mean, this is not a way to treat people. It's not a way to move our country forward. So I do support the legalization of it, but again, it needs to be done in a responsible way. We need to study the effects similar to tobacco and alcohol use. We know what it does. We need to alert people to what it does and move forward. But certainly it has value, a proven value.
Thank you. And our next question will start at the other end and begin with Mr. St. Clair. A second district congressperson, what would you do to help improve federal, state, district, and community relationships with Wabanaki nations, with our Native Americans here in Maine? Mr. St. Clair, you have 2 minutes.
So I've spent a lot of time working with Maine's tribes in the effort to create the national monument. You know, I was working in an area that was, you know, a deep, rich part of the Penobscot's mythology and part of a pilgrimage, Mount Katahdin, the east branch of the Penobscot River, the river that's the namesake of their tribe. And I learned a lot about the culture, the development of the language, and the deep connection they have to the outdoors and our natural resources. I think we need to honor their sovereignty. We need to recognize that their government should work in tandem with our government, both on a state and a federal level, and understand and recognize that oftentimes our views are the same, that we want clean air and clean water. We want to be able to eat fish out of the river. We want to be able to make sure that we have access to the outdoors. And in the case of the Maine tribal nations, that, you know, these are sacred places, and they need to be recognized and thought of as sacred places. The antagonistic relationship that's happening now with the Secretary of Interior and with the Trump administration, and also with our governor, is deplorable, and it should absolutely not be what we are focusing on. We should be focusing on strengthening the relationships between the tribes and the federal government, especially within the Department of Indian Affairs and the Department of Interior.
Thank you. Mr. Olson, you have 2 minutes.
I think, you know, that's something that really has always, I've had great dismay over the fact that how we've treated Native people in these communities and how we've just trampled on things and then don't do anything to help to meet people halfway, to meet them, to bring them to the table. And for me, as a congressperson, it would be to meet them at a table, bring them into the conversation ahead of time, not when it's going through something, through a permitting process or something, but have people have ongoing conversations, have ongoing meetings, having ongoing town hall meetings. You know, remember when we used to have those? But having them with all of these different groups and being out there and being available to the folks to know what's going on. I mean, the travesty is, I mean, many people have probably been to Mount Rushmore, and you know, growing up, I thought it was the most wonderful thing in the world. And then I heard the story of Mount Rushmore and how sacred it is to the Lakota Sioux, and it's decimated. I mean, it's still a sacred place, but we just went in and did whatever, and I think we've done a lot of that in Maine, and I think with tribal rights for fishing and water, we have to revisit those things, and we have to go back and look at the Indian Act that was passed in 1980 and really look to those people and say, you know, what are the needs within your community, and how can Maine meet those needs? And I also think it would be a very good thing for whomever is our next congressman, and I hope it's me, to sit on the Indian Affairs Committee, because I don't think that that's something that's been done with anybody who's served in Congress from the state of Maine.
Thank you. Mr. Golden, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. For starters, just treat them as the equals that they are. If you will hold town halls in your community, in Maine CD2, then you should go hold a town hall on their tribal lands. If you're, making yourself available to your constituents, take the time to go make yourself available to them as well. Let's not always just put the burden on them to reach out to you. Make the effort to go out and meet them where they're at. I think that's one thing that would improve communication for starters. I worked for 2 years down in Washington in the U.S. Senate, and they were reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act. And there was a debate about whether or not we would allow American citizens who had committed acts of domestic violence, domestic abuse, or other crimes against tribal members on tribal lands to be tried in tribal courts. And I was quite shocked at times to see the resistance to that. There was resistance among the Maine delegation. I didn't understand that. Equality before the law. Due course would have been there for any American citizen to appeal any decision by a tribal court, to go to a U.S. district court and have their right to a day in court. It just seemed wrong to me. So that's something I'd like to see changed for sure. The Land Settlement Act is a real sticking point here. It is a document that is open to interpretation. The tribes have asked that people make an effort at times to interpret it differently. I think that they need a congressman who will share their voice in that and not just always think about it from the perspective of government. Sometimes our job is to stick up for people against government. And so in this regard, I think the tribes need a voice in Congress who will speak to the U.S. Attorney General's office, who will speak to the Maine Attorney General's office, who will speak to our governor and to other federal departments to say, I'm not so sure that you've got this right. That's I think, what they're asking for, to be completely honest with you.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Fulford.
I think that if, in serving the 2nd District, that you are representing all 4 of the tribes of Maine, and all 5 of the tribal leaderships. I've so far met with 3 of the 5 chiefs and intend to meet with all of them to find out and listen to what issues are important to them. The Land Claims Settlement Act actually applies differently to the different tribes, depending on whether or not they even existed, or whether they existed, whether they're recognized, in 1980. So understanding that each tribe has its own priorities about where we go forward, but certainly the Violence Against Women's Act is, right now the way it's being enacted is not right. And there needs to be accountability for anybody who's not part of a tribe, who's on Native reservation and has done acts of, has done crimes. So that needs to be addressed. I think the having a strong support in the federal government that will listen to the tribes and recognize that our job as a representative is to serve everybody in the district, and to be able to be open to learning what is the priorities. That has to be foundational. So. We've had a long history of breaking our treaties, and it's pretty much gone always one direction, and that needs to be also acknowledged. So,
thank you. I have one more short question, and then the final question will be, why do you believe you are the best candidate for the Democratic Party to nominate to run against Congressman Bruce Poliquin? But I have a nice short question for you. 10 seconds or less for each of you. If you do not win the primary, are you prepared to give your enthusiastic support to whichever candidate does win the Democratic primary, and to encourage your supporters to rally behind the party nominee? I'll begin with you, Mr. Fulford.
absolutely. This is, our goal has to be actually transforming the direction of society. Any of the candidates up here will do a vastly better job than Bruce Poliquin will, because he is not trying to change things.
Mr. Golden, 10 seconds.
Yes, absolutely. And if I lose as well as the House Assistant Majority Leader, I will be out on the campaign trail working with your local state representatives to make sure that you have the right representation in the Maine State House of Representatives as well.
Mr. Olson.
300% yes.
And also, yes, certainly supporting, the end goal here is to beat Bruce Poliquin, and that's what I'm laser focused on. It's also about holding the State House. It's about winning back the Senate here in Maine, and it's also about winning the gubernatorial election. We have an incredibly important midterm election in front of us, and we all need to stay laser focused on the greater good.
And laser focused to the last second of his time as well. We have one final question, and as I stated earlier, the question is, why do you believe you are the best candidate for the Democratic Party to nominate to run against Bruce Poliquin? We'll go down the aisle from the opposite end. We'll begin with Mr. St. Clair.
All right, well, thank you again for coming out tonight. And this
2
has been,
minutes, by the way.
This has been a real a pleasure to see all of you and have engagement. So I, over my life here in Maine, have grown up in the district, spent most of my life in the district. I've seen small businesses start and grow to large businesses. I've run small businesses. I have employees now and know what it's like to work on very controversial efforts and how to win, how to bring people together. But most importantly, I know how to beat Bruce Poliquin. In 2014, when he was elected, he became the ultimate obstruction to the national monument effort. And he held congressional field hearings, he lobbied the White House, he used his position as a member of Congress in the majority to hold congressional field hearings, to continually put the national monument on trial. And we were able to overcome those obstacles. We were able to take a grassroots foundation of support directly at him and completely overpower him at every turn. I know how his campaign staff works, I know how his congressional office works, and I know how he behaves, and I know all of their vulnerabilities, and I'm prepared to take that knowledge and the energy that I will bring to this race directly at him and beat him again, this time electorally.
Thank you. Mr. Olson, 2 minutes.
Thank you all for coming out. This is a great turnout, great space. This is a race for me that I got into because I was tired of seeing people serving in Washington who have lost touch with the communities that they allege to serve. We have fewer and fewer citizen legislators in our U.S. Congress. We have people who are not really affiliated with the communities that they live in or that they're representing and are representing interests that have nothing to do with the people of Maine, like the financial services industry. For me, it came down to, I want to see somebody in there who has served at the local level, who served on the local school board, who served as a selectman on your planning board, who's dealt with people in the community, who's actually had to take the hard choice on votes, and knowing full well that that person who doesn't agree with what how you voted is going to find you. They're going to find you in the store, they're going to show up at your house, or they're going to see you in the ferry line. And I've been in all those places, wondering why we voted a certain way and being able to justify that vote and being able to talk to people. But I've also been a small business person. I've also been a person who struggled with finding affordable health insurance for my family. And it finally got to the point where it was something that I needed to take on another job to pay for that health insurance. And that shouldn't be the case in the future. People should be able to have health care, and that we all have a certain level of care, and that we're not taking things or doing things that we don't necessarily want to do because we have to, simply to keep ourselves and our families above water. So for me, it really came down to being a citizen legislator, knowing the people in the community, knowing how to take the hard votes, knowing how to work across the aisle, and knowing how to talk to people who maybe don't hold all the same beliefs that you have, but being able to have a conversation about everything from healthcare to guns to water rights and to extractive industries. I mean, there's so much out there, and it's something that has always been near and dear to my heart, and how that you really, if you can work effectively at the local level, you will be able to do great things at the national level.
Thank you. Mr. Golden, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. You don't have to wonder what I'm going to do as your congressman, all right? I'm serving in the state legislature for the last 4 years. I've got the record that tells you exactly what I will do. Do your homework. Go look at what I've done in the Maine state legislature. Go find every voting card, every scorekeeper that's out there. The LCV, actually, Lucas was chair of that board. Thank you for endorsing my previous campaigns for Congress, for the work that I've done to support the environment. Labor unions, standing by our teachers, Planned Parenthood, whatever it was, the democratic values that you care about. I have been in the fight at a very tough time in this state. You need an experienced leader. 4 years as a public servant. I love what I do. This is the best thing that I've done in my life. alongside serving in the military. And so on that, experienced leadership started for me in the military. I led troops in combat. One thing I learned is that you always, when it's time to, for instance, when it's time to eat a meal, lowest ranking person goes first, highest ranking person goes last. That is a very symbolic lesson for young leaders about what this is all about. It's not about you, it's about the people that you take care of. It's about the people that you lead, the people that you serve. That's something that I understand. That's why after just 2 years in the Maine State Legislature, my colleagues elected me to be the House Assistant Majority Leader. I'm leading 73 other Democrats. Experience matters, you need experienced leadership, and I've got the record that you can count on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Fulford, you have 2 minutes.
I think it's important that we have actually a blue-collar, working-class person running for office, that it contrasts very starkly with Bruce Poliquin. You've got to remember the last Democrat to hold this office had 20 years in the paper mills. I think it matters what life you've led so that you actually can know what life for people in this district is actually like. I think that it's also important that, I ran for state senate. My positions, then are exactly the same as they are now. And I think important in beating Bruce Poliquin is to remember what happened in the presidential caucuses when the turnout for Bernie Sanders was overwhelming in CD2. And those people that were so excited about that also then left in droves and did not vote. And that led to, catastrophic effects for the Democratic Party up and down the ballot. Those voted because I think my record of having been a strong Bernie supporter and then also supporting Hillary fully in the general, I think it gives a credibility that, one, my positions have never changed, and that I have the endorsement of the local Bernie, the Bernie-crats, that if we are going to have the people who had left the party because they felt that they had been betrayed or not listened to with respect, to be willing to come back and vote for somebody with a D next to their name, I think you need to have a credibility that you were there all along, and I bring that. So, and I think that's the key to actually beating Poliquin. It's not the Democratic voters, it's the independent, feisty voters that so many of our friends are and some of us are. So, good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I turn the microphone over to Yvette Robinson, I want to thank all 4 of the candidates for not only coming all the way up here to Farmington, in the largest congressional district east of the Mississippi, but in having a very thoughtful and civil discussion on some very important issues. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out. I wish we had time to get to all of the excellent questions that we had, but I think we got a good read on those sorts of things. And without further ado, let me yield the floor to Yvette Robinson.
Wow, you guys have been a fabulous audience with great questions. You make me so proud to be part of Franklin County. I'd like to take a few minutes to just recognize a few people. An event like this does not just happen on its own. You can see how smoothly it has run, how we are on time. And I would just like to thank a few people. There was a committee of students and community members led by Lisa Licious. Other members on that committee were Vicki Cohen, Jan Collins, Aislinn Forbes, Ben Fowler, Ellen Grunblatt, Greg Kimber, Hope Lash, Astra Pearson, John Rosenwald, Jeffrey Willie, Kathy Wimmett, and Samantha Wood. Thank you for planning this. I'd also like to address our candidates. Some of you probably know this, but these candidates have all been out here more than once to Franklin County, and I appreciate the fact that they value our vote and that they want to hear our voices and hear what's on our mind. We also appreciate that you are giving us great choices to choose from in June, and that we acknowledge it takes great courage, a lot of time, and hard work to do this, so thank you. Yes, and we have RCB. As a thank you, you are each going to get a homegrown from Franklin County maple syrup. Nice. And then finally, I want to acknowledge our wonderful moderator who arguably had the biggest job here tonight in keeping all the questions going and keeping everybody on task. You too will be getting some maple syrup. So this is it. We are ending on time. I want you to remind you to vote on June 12th. It's super, super important, and have a lovely night.